Welcome everybody back to panel 2. It's called Refugees Helping Themselves and Being Helped by Hosts, Integration into a Process. And like we said earlier, we think of integration, the Refugees in Towns Project does, as a mutual experience and an ongoing relationship between newcomers, whoever they may be, whether they're returnees like Tash was talking about, or refugees or IDPs, or any kinds of immigrants. So those on what we're calling newcomers maybe, and long-term residents of a town who may or may not be citizens of that country, but have lived there for a long time. And so we're kind of thinking about that relationship. We call them hosts. They may not necessarily think of themselves as being hosts, but so we want to talk about that relationship, and also in particular, because we have quite a lot of, several of our panelists today are representing or work with organizations, agencies, resettlement agencies, or civil society organizations. And we're going to hear from five cities. And they represent organizations of all sizes, ranging from very large international ones like IRC, that Graeme's going to talk about the IRC perspective, International Rescue Committee, to national and regional ones like the International Institute of New England, that's what Cheryl's going to talk about, to smaller support organizations like Giran's Arabic Community Action in New Britain, Connecticut. So we've got a range of organizations that are going to talk to us today about their studies. We've asked them to identify some lessons and best practices that they've learned about their cities or their regions. They've already recorded really interesting videos. I hope you've had a chance to watch them. And they're going to take 5 minutes to introduce themselves and then briefly describe the main takeaways from their study that help them think about what facilitates integration. Then I'm going to ask a couple questions and then we'll open it up. So I've slightly rearranged the order. I hope you don't mind, people. And in fact, I would like to start with Graeme. I would like you to set out some of the issues, Graeme, that you talked about in your video and from the perspective of the International Rescue Committee. So Graeme, are you ready to do that? I
am. Thank you, Karen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, Karen, and thank you, Charles, and hello to everybody. It's really great to be here. I have to apologize for breaking ranks slightly from the sort of paired format of the conference and for presenting something that isn't necessarily an in-depth case study. But thank you to the organizers for your flexibility on this. My work at the IRC tends to be multi-sited across several of the 25 offices that we have in the United States. And I think it's quite superficial compared to the richly grounded and localized perspectives on integration that are being shared at the conference and that we saw in the last session, which I really enjoyed, excuse me, and which is a really great session. So I'm not really going to talk about one place, but rather about one particular concern that seems to arise in all refugee integration contexts, and that's the relationship between work and integration. I don't think it's an exaggeration to suggest that employment is the primary way that resettlement agencies and others who support refugee resettlement imagine and measure refugee integration in resettlement context. If you think of how we fetishize the kind of 90-day employment figure, it's a really important figure, and we assume that refugees are assumed to be more integrated if they earn more money, and this is a sort of primary indicator that we often work with. But I think increasingly I feel that this measure is inadequate and kind of stuck in 19th century thinking about work, ideas of the labor theory of value, as well as Puritan ideas of work as virtuous in its own right, the idea of dignity of work and work as an antidote to the evils of idleness, etc. It's also rooted in some very sort of strongly patriarchal ideas of sort of male factory labor. But one of the effects of the pandemic, certainly on me, and I think perhaps on some of you, is to enable us to think more deeply about work, what we value about our own work, what work that is done by others is really important to our lives, and how work gets valued and rewarded in our societies. And earlier this week, I interviewed by phone a man who works as a lawyer, or who worked as a lawyer in Afghanistan, and who now supports his large family as a security guard in an expensive West Coast city. So of course he expressed relief that he could pay his rent and meet the basic needs of his family. But I was left wondering what his work actually means to him and how it'll shape his integration experience, his identity, his social status in his community, and so on. And to think about this, I found two anthropologists quite helpful on this question, and neither of them actually have anything to do with refugees per se. The first one is Arthur Kleinman, who's perhaps the leading intellectual figure in medical anthropology and a prominent Harvard academic. Several years ago, his wife, who was also a prominent academic, was diagnosed with early onset dementia. And once her condition deteriorated to the point that she needed full-time care, he stepped away from his academic life to provide that to her. And he's written and published a lot on his deep reflections on that experience, and makes some interesting points about the value of work. He acknowledges the frustration and the tedium of caring for somebody in the kind of condition that she was in, but ultimately a growing awareness that caring for a person at such a critical moment in their life is perhaps the most important work that we can expect to do. So his work in the wake of this highlights care as a kind of critical social and moral practice beyond just the sort of economic value or the rate at which it's compensated economically. And this is largely unrecognized, undervalued, and taken for granted. And I think it's a kind of work that goes on in refugees, in refugee communities, in the process of integrating to an extent that we haven't really begun to see or recognize or measure. And if we think about how many immigrants and refugees in wealthy countries work in some aspect of the care industry, they generally work under highly exploitative conditions where the value of that care is not really recognized. A second anthropologist that I find helpful in this regard came to mind recently when I learned of his untimely death. David Graeme from the LSE is known as an anarchist anthropologist. He was very prominent in Occupy Wall Street, and a few years ago he wrote an interesting book called Bullshit Jobs. This is the title of the book. So bullshit jobs are jobs that are often well paid, but they're BS jobs because they seem to be both unfulfilling and unnecessary. The Soviet Union was famous for making up BS jobs in order to maintain the illusion of full employment. And Graeme argues that this is also a feature of modern 21st century capitalist economies, where mechanization and automation hasn't delivered the shorter work week that Keynes famously predicted in 1930. So people are working harder than ever, but more on tasks that perhaps up to 20% of us feel are meaningless or that we know to be pointless. And his book identifies 5 archetypal BS jobs. There's flunkies, goons, duct tapers, box tickers, and taskmasters. And the critical counterpoint to overpaid BS jobs is that really important work is often disparaged and dismissed in the marketplace and often paid very poorly. People who actually make things or maintain things or teach children or who provide care to others, linking it back to Kleinman, are somehow punished in the labor market precisely because their job has purpose or because they enjoy what they're doing. And we're not even talking here about artists and musicians and people who work in other fields that enrich our lives. But their low pay tells us very little about the full social and moral value of their work, including the contributions that these make towards strengthening local communities and making them healthier and happier. So these two questions, just summing up, lead me to question the validity of wage as a meaningful measure of the value of refugee work and integration, which is something that we do routinely on a daily basis. I think we do our clients a disservice when we focus on this metric or solely on this metric to determine their impact on or the scope or scale of their contributions to the local communities that they integrate into. And I think we all know this intuitively, but we still lack the language to articulate an economics of refugee integration that is unconstrained by these somewhat outdated notions of work and value. And this is why I'm really excited by conferences like these, which invite us to think about refugee integration in a more kind of integrated way. I think it's, it's more timelier than ever. And I'll just end by thanking the organizers for opening up such an interesting space for these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Graeme. What a wonderful and provocative and interesting way to kick off this panel. You've just raised some super interesting ideas, and yeah, we will return to that. Thank you for that. Rethinking the idea of work. I love it. And how work, yeah, okay, well, let's not go, we'll discuss, to be discussed. Our next panelists are going to be Joy Al-Nemri and Maha Abdullah from New Britain, Connecticut. Maybe you guys can introduce yourselves, yeah?
Of course,
yes.
Thank you. So my name is Maha Abdullah. I am the site community coordinator of Jiran and a co-founder. We've worked with refugees and recently settled immigrants in New Britain, Connecticut, and we worked with Arabic-speaking refugees, per se, and mostly from Syria, Iraq, Morocco, Yemen, and Sudan. So we have a growing population of Arabic-speaking families here in New Britain, and this is why we were able to convince Middlebury College to bring this program to New Britain, Connecticut, in order to meet the needs of the community and actually to fill in the gap. This is what I first discovered. I've been working with refugees and recently settled families for many years. I've been trying to create programs and try to kind of like tweak the programming that we have available here for them or for such population. But I found a very big gap between what the agencies that bring the refugees give them or offer them and what they actually need, especially taking into consideration the cultural competency piece that I found a lot of training needed. And I actually trained more than 45 agencies who work with refugees here in Connecticut to give them an idea and make them aware of the challenges that this population deal with, especially after the expectation that they will be settled or gaining or on the road to gain their financial independency and their life independency here and acclimating to the United States life within like 6 or 8 months. And we know, according to the presentation I recorded with Joy, it shows that this really persists to years actually. And so in order to meet these needs and to fill in the gap, we created my colleagues, Emily Goldman and Kristen, who's a supervisor of the Arabic program in Jordan from Middlebury College. We created this program called Jiran, and Jiran in Arabic means neighbors. It is in Arabic, it's like a language and refugees. It's like a twofold program. It's an intensive summer action program that connects the fluent Arabic-speaking students, college students, with the resettled refugees here in the United States for a mutual learning, cultural and linguistic learning. And we hold it here. So we rent a house for the students, and we match them with host families. And these students create personalized, individualized or personalized action plans with their assigned refugee families. We introduce them to the challenges and they see it, they live with them, they go to the host families every day, and they create workshops that help the refugees, but also these families hold workshops to also educate the students about their culture. So it's like a mutual learning experience. And one of the questions that came to mind is that how aware is the American society that these refugees live within of their challenges, or how aware are they of their culture or where they're coming from? And so we saw a big gap, and this is where we hold these workshops, and we also bring speakers to help these families get access to resources or know more about life in the United States or their new life. Now the refugees, on the other hand, help the students learn a new dialect. Sometimes we match them them with the same. As you know, Arabic-speaking countries have one formal language, but they have so many dialects even within the same country. And so these students enhance their proficiency of Arabic language. I teach them the highest level of Arabic, which is a non-formal, al-Ammiya, and also they practice it on a daily basis with these families. Now, although that there are several institutions and agencies in Connecticut or in New Britain who can help these families, but they always come short of providing the exact needs, especially when you have programs like ESL programs through the library. These programs are overwhelmed, and as you know, as we said in our presentation, the language barrier is #1 challenge that they deal with, and it takes years sometimes for them to the language piece. We noticed that the literacy volunteers program has a very long waiting list. We know that there are programs there set in place, but they don't work because of either immobility for these families, or the access is not there. All that the family structure is like they have so many children that they're not able to attend these classes, or they cannot go to that place. And so one of the things we did.
Oops, Maha, we've lost you. I'm wondering if it's an opportunity to hear from Joy perhaps a little bit, because we're kind of almost out of time. I'd love to hear from Joy. Joy, do you have anything to add?
Sure.
Of course, yes. My name is Joy Al-Nemri. I'm an anthropologist that did research with Jiran and was also one of the program participants during the summer of 2018. So I was on the ground assigned to a Yemeni family, both simultaneously researching, the efficacy of our program and also engaging in community outreach. And just to reiterate specifically about the context of New Britain with the predominantly Arabic-speaking populations we were working with, we found with our research that there were resources available, but they were not being allocated. They were not accessible. For Arabic-speaking populations, it doesn't suffice to give them, paperwork and fusha when they might not be literate in formal modern standard Arabic, right? There could be ESL classes that, families could possibly access, only they're backlogged for a year, and so they're not getting any of that aid. Or there are programs that are within the local community, but no car to physically help them get to that space, or childcare services, which would allow them to kind of integrate more. So when I was there during the summer, I actually created through the YWCA a women's fitness program where over the summer I was leading the program for about 30 women. And throughout the year, 11 women had a fitness membership where they had an Arabic-speaking fitness instructor help them, have fitness classes with their children, having babysitting access for free, in addition to opportunities to integrate with people who they would have never otherwise connected with. And so that's just a snippet of what we've done, and we're so excited to be here and continue.
Great, thank you so much. That's really interesting to hear. We'll be coming back to all of you to talk more. I'd like to go to Yuliia Kabanets now from the Ukraine. Yuliia, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here and continue this discussion. My name is Yuliia. I live in Kyiv, in the capital of Ukraine, and I'm an internally displaced person myself, and I was moved from Donetsk to Kyiv in 2014. And my research for Refugees in Towns project was also focused on IDPs in Kyiv and their integration. It's been already 6 years since the war in the east of Ukraine has started, and since the Crimea was occupied by Russia. There are many things that have changed, but there are also many things that were, many problems and issues that were not addressed at all by the government. One interesting thing is when I was conducting interviews, most mostly, well, I was talking to many students or those who were students at that time or teachers at the universities. And it seemed like universities really help IDPs to integrate in the city. At least it was the case for Kyiv. They felt, those who were students, they felt like really more integrated and involved in life of the city than those for whom that was not the case. And also one unique thing about Ukraine is that we have 18 displaced universities that were displaced from the occupied areas and yeah, from those areas which are not controlled by Ukrainian government. Actually, I think one of the main problems here in Ukraine is that the issues that IDPs face, they are underestimated because this is just a moving inside the country, right? So it seems like not such a big deal, but it actually is. Well, it is considered sometimes that IDPs do not face such problems as refugees, for example, which is maybe true, but there are also many other problems which IDPs have face. Yeah, there are also many reasons why people could not move and they still are on occupied areas. And in this situation when the government's help is, well, almost invisible for now as well, so all the responsibility is taken by NGOs, host communities, if this is about small cities and towns, and also universities, not at the last point. And I would say that the support of those displaced universities is like more visible because there are also many IDPs in staff, so they understand the problems well better. And there were many students who moved with the universities, so it's like support from both sides. Yeah, but according to my interviews and research, like even if the university doesn't do anything in particular, like to support IDPs, it is much easier for them to adapt and to integrate in this new place. Yeah, I want to highlight also that this help from universities, it is usually informal. It's not coming like from the government, or there are not so many programs except Ukraine, Donbas Ukraine and Crimea Ukraine that help people from occupied areas to apply to Ukrainian universities, even if they don't have certificates or all the documents. And sometimes, for example, just an example from my university, the head of the department gathered some IDPs. I think there were like 5 or 6 people of us, and he just asked like, look guys, if you need anything, just tell us, we can maybe figure it out. But it was also like when I was applying for university, they didn't want to give me place at the dormitory, but for some vulnerable groups it was supposed to be given, but IDPs were not in that group, which was like very weird. Yeah, so it is sometimes it's not yeah, it's underestimated, I would say.
Great,
yeah.
Thank you, Yuliia. I'm going to just stop you because we can come back to discuss some of these interesting issues that you've mentioned, but let's just get through all of our panelists. Sure. Next up is Ruby and Ali. I'm sorry. I wanted to have Cheryl and Chris. Are you ready, guys?
Sure, I'm gonna let Chris start, and then I'm gonna say a few words at the end. Chris.
Okay.
All right, hi, so my name is Chris Ko. I'm with the International Institute here today with Cheryl Hamilton, who just spoke. And during our video, we covered 2 different reports that we worked on. So one of them was focused on the city of Lowell, which is where we have one of our sites. And the focus of the report was we worked in partnership with New American Economy and Welcoming America to produce a report about how immigrants have contributed to the city, both economically and socially over the past decade. And as some of you have mentioned previously, a lot of the measures of social and integration in general for refugees and immigrants is economics based, which leads us to the second report that we worked on in partnership with Boston College, and that was looking at employment retention over the past decade with the clients that we have worked with in our 3 sites. So Boston, Lowell, and Manchester, New Hampshire. And that was a report looking at how job retention is affected by education, the social context, and the community around you, because we wanted to look more holistically at what kind of things impact how people integrate into a community. And again, there isn't a lot of other work that is non-economics based. So that is one of our goals going forward, to develop more holistic means of measuring what it means to become a part of an inclusive community and feeling like you belong.
Thanks, Chris. And one of the areas that I know is not just our resettlement agency, but others, is being really collaborative and more inclusive in who's mapping out these directions. So most recently, not surprisingly, healthcare is a place where people can work. There's a better career ladder. And so the Institute's been taking a lead in making sure to bring together business owners, universities, mutual aid associations, much more broad. And we say more about that in our video and you can watch it. I'm just gonna add one more comment, and I really wanna appreciate Graeme for his comments about how we can think bigger and broader around integration. Historically, my whole career has been in refugee employment, but in the last few years, I currently direct Suitcase Stories, which we'll talk more about at the 4:30 panel. But that isn't just an art project. For us, it's a social integration project. And my frustration with the field of refugee integration studies is the lack of attention to the impact of social integration on every other indicator. And what I mean by that is, if you don't have connections in the community that are meaningful, your job opportunities are less. The way your teachers treat you in the classroom might not be as positive. The interest of an employer to hire you, your neighbors might not make you feel safe. And so the reason the Institute has expanded beyond direct service to include Suitcase Stories is to begin to change that dialogue. But also, it's one of the ways, for Suitcase at least, it's the way to get non-immigrants involved directly in our programs. Because usually there's volunteering, but in our program, they actually stand up and tell stories about how their lives were impacted. So I'll leave it there. I'm excited to hear questions from people and what others are offering.
Great, thank you so much to both of you. And now Ruby and Ali from Amman. Are you there?
Yeah, Ruby is having some technical difficulties, but I can talk a little bit about our report and hope that she joins back in. So hi, everyone. I've really enjoyed everyone's comments so far. My name is Ali Hawkins. I'm the Assistant Director of the Boston Consortium for Arab Region Studies based in Boston, but worked with Ruby Assad, my colleague, over the summer of, I think it was 2018, 2017, a while ago, to conduct the interviews and author the report on Amman, Jordan for refugees in towns. As many of you, I'm sure, are well aware, Amman is home to many diverse groups of refugees, Palestinians, Iraqis, Syrians, Yemenis, Somalis, Sudanese. So we had a lot of different perspectives when we were speaking to people that were very closely related to, their experience as refugees from different countries, but all living in the same place. So we discussed in our presentation some of the key issues that our interlocutors brought up, primarily being access to livelihoods, and then access to critical services like healthcare and education. And Graeme, I found your comments about work and livelihoods and how we use that as a measure for refugee integration particularly interesting. because in my work, at least, I've learned a lot about the work permit initiative for Syrian refugees that's happening in Amman. And for those who aren't familiar, this is a program that helps employ Syrian refugees in the formal sector as opposed to the informal sector where many of them are already working anyway. And it has, you know, been quite successful, but it's also just a drop in the bucket, and it also excludes other groups of refugees who are facing similar challenges in the city. So this is one thing that our interlocutors brought up, along with the very, very high cost of living in Amman as critical issues. And really for them, it seemed like the identity politics piece of it was a huge part of it, their integration experience as well. I think at least, you know, in regular conversations I've had with people who maybe don't have a background in refugee integration, particularly in the Middle East, there's an assumption that Syrians or Palestinians or Iraqis who have gone to Jordan might have an easier time integrating because of a shared culture or shared language, but our interviewees really dispelled that assumption quite quickly, that despite sharing a language or many different traditions, that doesn't necessarily pave the way for refugee integration, and that, you know, access to these services, being unable to find a job, these are the kinds of nuts and bolt things that they were really concerned about. So I know, and I was really hoping Ruby could speak to this because she has much more experience than I do, but in terms of our presentation, we were talking a little bit about how research has been used, and Amman in particular is, I would say, almost an over-researched site in terms of refugee integration. It's a hub for a lot of NGOs that are operating and doing things in the region writ large. So there's a lot of information, and I'm really hoping that these projects like RIT and other initiatives, primarily led by universities, other think tanks, in coordination with NGOs, like this kind of research is going to be more heavily utilized in the future. I know Ruby has personally worked on several really successful initiatives that were more grassroots and focused on relationships, coalition building, kind of community cohesion type efforts, and that those had some very promising results. And I'm hoping if she joins back, she can talk a little bit more about her experience with those. But I'm really looking forward to everyone's questions. I'll try and keep it short and end it there, but
great. Thanks so much, Ali. Let's hope Ruby can join us.
Yeah, we're working on it.
Leila, you are the person who's bringing up our last presentation with your super interesting perspective on building community through art. Are you there, Leila?
Yes.
Great. Hi.
Okay. I'm really sorry. Unfortunately, I was supposed to work with a community activist on art because she initiated this therapy session because she was coming from a social work background. So she had this, you know, the experience, and she started that plan with working with refugees that they have, you know, mental health issue, and asking them to get engaged in art and making creative works that then how, and then assess how that art and, you know, crafting or creative job can help them to deal with mental health. So, so we had a very nice plan, and I was in connection with Charles, but COVID started, so just we lost the connection, and then of course everything got you know, into some sort of influence by COVID. But in my research, I worked with Syrian refugees, and after 2011 that they came here to the United States, and then I conducted my research in two main area, Dearborn, that they have Dearborn has, it's a house, is a home of very well-established community, Arab American community, So they came here 100, 150 years ago, and then they are very, very established, and the community is very strong in terms of providing services with the new group of refugees that they came here, and mostly Syrians. So then I worked closely with Syrian refugee women. So I started with my research with the big question that how we define refugees in international law, and then how we practice this on the ground in the United States. And then I started, just doing my ethnography with them. How do they make sense of self? How do they make sense of community? So, and then I extended my work to another city, Lansing. The Lansing is it's political capital of Michigan, and then less integrated in terms of having community, Arab American community. So then throughout my work, what came up was that the issue or the matter of integration. That yes, I saw in Syrian refugee women that they live in Michigan, in Dearborn, they started rebuilding the neighborhood that were relics of economic crisis in 1960s, started in 1950s and 1960s. They brought life to the neighborhood, and they got help from the community members that they were already there, and then they started building those houses. And then also there are very strong community organizations that are on the ground, like Access, that they provide services with refugees. But I at some points when I got back between two different cities in Lansing and Dearborn, the issue of integration came up. That how do we define integration? Like, just getting the help of community, it doesn't mean necessarily that you get access and then you get to into interaction with outsiders of the community. That's the thing that I saw the difference. I saw in some ways the difference of potentials or good potentials or some sort of flaws in two different areas that I conducted my research. So of course the sense of community is very strong in Dearborn. They are surrounded by their same language people, and either from Iraq, either from Palestine, Lebanon. That's just really helpful. But one basic example of that is that just can be considered as limit, is that so they are less tending to learn the language. They're less learn English language. I don't want to use that term in closure, but in some ways it reminds me, the situation reminds me of in Dearborn. While I had this research when I started working with a small group of Syrian refugee women in Lansing, because it's less just has a smaller community, Arab American community. They had to get into interaction with other people, with African Americans, with African refugees that they came from Africa, and then they started resettling in Lansing, or the white community in Lansing. That I see that how they evolved into. I doubt that.
Sorry to cut you off, but I really have to. We will continue.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
So interesting what you're saying, but we'll continue.
Of course. Sorry.
Hold your thought there. And we have one more person. That's Angelica who's going to talk to us about Albany Park, which is in Chicago. Angelica, are you ready to talk?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. I personally work at World Relief Chicago. I'm working right now in the Asylum Project. So it's a new initiative to provide case management to asylum seekers. And the researcher that I was partnering with is Saidouri Zomaya. She wasn't able to make it today, but the report basically works on all the multicultural waves of immigration and how integration has looked like when you have different communities of immigrants coming into the neighborhood of Albany Park in Chicago. Kind of rather smaller pocket of people considering the size of the city. and how the report looks at how the legacy of these different organizations or these different groups and how they have established legacy. I love how this connects to some of the questions we were asking at first regarding and how do we really measure the impact of refugees and immigrant communities. The idea behind this report is that immigrants, the best way to contribute to inclusion is not just investing in short-term impact, but actually really investing in empowering immigrant communities to establish long-term impact through creating institutional networks that will last and kind of go beyond their individual legacies. So we have looked at examples. For example, the first migrant wave that came into Albany Park was the Scandinavians. And they're really well known now for the establishment of two big organizations that serve the whole city of Chicago, the Swedish Hospital and the North Park University. But then moving down, we have different Asian communities, Koreans and Arabs, and now the most recent is the Hispanic community. And kind of the idea of the report is looking at how these different institutions that were set and established by different waves or immigrants that tried to serve their own people now broaden their scope to serve other people. And we have, for example, places like Hana Center that was established by Korean immigrants to serve Korean immigrants. And now they have kind of changed their program to be able to serve Hispanic immigrants and now are really focused on that population because that's the new wave of immigration that's coming to the neighborhood. So our main claim is in order to be able to create this two-way process of integration, we need to empower our immigrant communities to be able to set those lasting networks. And as World Relief as an agency for refugee resettlement, we have noticed also the changes in the community. And when, for example, refugees numbers started going low, that's when we said we need to find private funding to start a program that will serve asylum seekers. Because what happened is not that immigrants stop coming. Now they're coming through a different way. And the way they're coming comes with specific challenges unique to having this specific status. And with that, we just provide a couple of practical tips on how can organization on the ground continue to foster that legacy building in communities. So that's the gist of our report. You can read more about it. And I just look forward to interact with some of you in this time.
Great. Thank you so much, Angelica. That was great. Okay, so that's, I think we have heard from everyone. We've had some really interesting presentations. What I've been gathering from this is that Graeme started us off by making us all think about work and how work is often seen as the sort of the key metric of integration. At least that's how it's reflected in official programming. And he's kind of pushing us to think differently about work. So there's thinking about work, and then there's also several of you talked about language, and language is acquiring the language is often seen also as a metric of integration. And again, some of you are challenging this idea. Leila has been talking about art and the role of art in enabling integration. It's not a metric we usually use to think about as a way to help people and as a way to think about how people are, or measure how people are integrated. But certainly tomorrow we're going to be talking about that a lot. So we're going to be revisiting that topic. And yeah, and then Angelica just talked about how we can empower immigrant communities to go beyond these traditional metrics and to think about building networks and to think about building the capacity of people, of immigrants, to help each other, to help their own communities, and then even to go beyond their own communities. So we've had some interesting perspectives from everybody. If people have questions, this would be a good time to ask them or to raise them. But as I don't see any questions here, unless I'm missing it, Kelsey, am I missing some questions? If you have questions, please ask or raise your...
Allison does.
Yeah, I have a question. Sorry, I can't tell what other people can see, if they can see me or not, but just continuing on this theme of work, and Graeme, I completely understand your point about using, or how using refugee employment is kind of an incomplete or inaccurate measure of integration writ large. And this is kind of a question I'd just like to pose to everyone, is how do we balance, you know, the points you made about how that doesn't really necessarily represent integration, that it can take many different forms when you're looking at what integration means, what work means, with the fact that the point you raised that we live in a very capitalist, patriarchal society, and refugees at the end of the day, in order to survive within this system, do need to work in most cases. So I'm just curious, I mean, it could be a theoretical answer, it could be an anecdote from real life, but how other people might reconcile thinking about this inaccurate kind of system of measurement alongside like a very real, tangible need that people have.
Graeme, did you want to talk to that? And while you thinking about your response, Graeme, let me ask Joy, who's raised her hand. Joy, did you have a question?
I actually had a couple of responses to what Graeme had brought up, and I think it flows kind of nicely with the question that was just raised too, if I could maybe respond. Would it be okay if I did now for the
Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
Great. So one of the things that I was thinking that's pretty unique and radical about the GDON program is the fact that GDON is, even in its name, right, neighbors, really tries to be anti-hierarchical in its approach. And I think about the importance of what it means to interpolate labor, right, whether it's volunteer labor or paid labor. When the fluent Arabic-speaking students who come to New Britain, Connecticut, are linked with the refugee and immigrant Arabic-speaking families, they're both students, right? Engaging in this reciprocated act of mutual aid. It's no longer refugees being receptacles of aid, right? Being disempowered within that power dynamic, but rather the refugees are giving this beautiful linguistic cultural exchange, opening up an entire world of their experiences to and volunteering their time and their labor with the fluent Arabic speakers who are there to help them physically navigate through this new city, access resources, be middlemen in implementing a personalized action plan for them. And so in this way, I think it kind of makes us think critically about what it is to actually be a volunteer, right? Because they're both volunteering, right? What it means to be a student, what it means to be a partner. And through that, actually, we blossom really meaningful relationships and not only help connect the refugees to different existing resources, but also have those networks that build way after the program.
It's really, really wonderful comments and points that you're making, Joy. Graeme, did you want to respond or build on what Joy is saying? Or
yes, maybe just briefly. I think my response was very much in line with Joy's, and I think you made it much more clearly and articulately than I could have. But just to get back to Ali's point, around work and the necessity of work, it's obviously important that our clients have to work, as we all have to do, but I think much of the research focuses only on that, and I think we can win the battle for on the basis of the data that just examines the narrow economic contribution that refugees make. I'm busy conducting a study for UNHCR at the moment where we're looking at the impact of the literature on the impact of resettlement, and it's almost overwhelmingly suggests that with the right kind of support over the longer term, refugees are net contributors. So we can win the battle just on through those narrow parameters, at least on a kind of rational level. But I think what we're losing is the fact that refugees bring so much more than just their labor as it's compensated in a marketplace. And I feel like that's something that we can really build on, and really all of the presentations here do that in incredibly sort of creative and elegant ways. Refugees don't just bring their labor; they don't just learn English; they also bring their languages, which kind of enriches local communities in all kinds of ways. So I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, this is nicely said, wonderfully said, Graeme. I really love this, where this is going. I want to bring in Paul Miranda, we wrote a long question in the chat, but Paul, I want you to talk about it because Paul has a lot of experience in Cairo and Iraq. So Paul, you there?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, this was just for Leila. Sorry for the long question, but essentially, like, there was an episode of NPR's Code Switch recently that talked about like an incident where a very successful Palestinian business in Minneapolis, the owner's daughter, essentially they found old tweets of hers about like just horrifically racist things she had written, and this opened up a wider discussion about that. Typically, you see a lot of bodegas and corner shops that are run by Arabs in majority Black neighborhoods, so they're profiting off the local community but not reinvesting that money, and they're not even, like, not everyone, but even not employing locals. And you see that everywhere. In New York, bodegas are always run by Yemenis or Egyptians. They're not really employing people in Black neighborhoods. And so have you seen this sort of in Lansing and Dearborn? And, you know, how does that relate to even what we consider to be integrated to be?
Well, that's, thank you so much for mentioning that. That's the, you know, one of the side component of my research that I came across about that. You know, that's, you know, the difference that I was going to explain a little bit, that how we saw what I saw in Lansing as, you know, a diverse community. You know, the Syrian refugees also try to make themselves a little bit, you know, just to navigate those situation as people, low-income families, and having less access to resources, and then, you know, just being in an isolated area with other group of racial groups of that they were refugees, and that helped them. There were some tensions, but that helped them to came to a realization about race, and then provide some definitions of friendship and sense of community with other people outside their Arab language, Arab speaking people. But what I saw in Dearborn is totally different. People, they start in the circles that they had, in the, you know, gatherings that they had with this, literally they say some you know, offensive words against Black people, right, in African American. And also that, you know, that sense of community that was created, and everybody's talking, yeah, yes, Dearborn is a great community of our American community, but still there's question that how this community can build relationship, safe and respectful relationship, and accepting relationship with, for instance, other communities, especially African Americans. But there are some activities on the ground. There are some community organizations that they have been involved. For instance, last year they had a conference. They talked about the racism within the community, Arab American community, against African Americans. And the issue of those corner shops, that if you get in the corner shops that they're run by Arab American communities, you will see that this high glass that they did, because mostly of this they are located in African American and low-income communities and neighborhoods, right? So they are profiting of the African American communities in Detroit, but at the same time they kept that kind of, you know, prejudice against different racial groups in the U.S. That's the thing that came you know, led my research to that. So what do we mean by the integration? So we say that when we say that, okay, so how these refugees, for instance, from Arab American communities integrate, who is the one they want to integrate with? And then how is this integration process go through in terms of, you know, recognizing the community members, recognizing the right to those people that become their community, that become their group also, but with different racial background or different racial.
Wonderful. I'm going to stop you. It's a wonderful discussion, but we do have several people who wanted to talk. Chris Coe, you have your hand up. Chris, where are you?
I do. So I wanted to build on the earlier point about like the necessity of employment, but like going beyond that, I think a way to think about it would almost be like a hierarchy of needs where employment is necessary, but we should also go beyond that and look at things like civic engagement, whether they are engaged in the community, or if further down the line they help other members of their country of origin integrate into the community. So like for example, we recently partnered with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences on a nationwide study on civic engagement with immigrants. And one of the findings was that oftentimes newcomers and new Americans do want to get involved, but there are barriers to that, both in terms of things as simple as language, but also like the process, like how do you get involved? And I think it would be interesting to be able to study that more closely and like look at what kinds of barriers immigrants face and like how we can help to facilitate their involvement in different aspects of life here.
Yeah, can I jump in with that on Chris? So two things on that comment. I absolutely agree. There's been a lot of movement to like creating stipends for participation even in art projects and civic engagement, because you're assuming that that person has the same times and hours to work. But Ali, is it? I just want to echo, I hear you. Like, I'm a pragmatic person. I'm an artist during the evening, but during the day, I'm like a practitioner that's like, yeah, but how do I fund this? And how do I make sure my clients are off of welfare? I will say that I still remain optimistic. 20 years ago when I started this field, we didn't have conferences on integration like this. You didn't see at a city and a state level policies asking you to look beyond employment, so I'm encouraged. That said, I do think it's not going to be led from the government, particularly with this administration, we know for sure, but I really do think it's being more thoughtful in bringing in business leaders and your foundation support. And making foundations and making businesses that underwrite programs say, what is your measurement? And to be an advocate for making that measurement broader than employment, because really we know that that's how you end up funding and be able to change the outcomes of your programs. And that's what I've been really excited about that's been happening. I know 10 years ago when I sat on there was actually a study where a bunch of us got together at the federal level. I think Graeme, you might have been there. We tried to like redesign the integration measurement for the federal refugee resettlement program. We met for 1.5 years and the outcome was employment. It still was employment, not because we didn't believe it should be bigger than that, but because the funding is such that it's such a limited time period that to measure their long-term integration in any other area, social, civic, or otherwise, there wasn't funding for it. And so we then said, all right, then where's the funding? And that's where it's led to this kind of stuff. And so I remain optimistic, not government funding wise, but everything else. So.
Super interesting. It's great to have your perspectives on this, because one thing I should mention is that what we want to do after the conference is have conference proceedings and have a report from the conference. And we really value all of this discussion, which will go into it. But if you have additional comments or thoughts that you want to feed into this, please just send it to us in some form or another, and we would definitely put it into this report that's going to go out. We have Charles and Joy, but also Joy, is your hand still up again, or is it from before?
It's definitely up. I had a couple of responses to some of the questions that were brought up and kind of statements. And I'm having an issue with the fact, that the way that Arab integration is kind of being framed, at least from what I'm noticing from some of the comments. And I think it's eliding some of the racial injustice that we see that's perpetuated within Arabic speaking communities. And so when we say Arab, right, that's not racially exclusive towards, an ambiguous brown, right? You have people from all shades of the sun, right? People as light as my skin tone, and you have Black people who are also just as Arab as any light-skinned Syrian, right? And so when we're talking about, so for instance, I believe Miranda's question, about, racial injustice within the community and how Arab refugees in the United States or Arab immigrants in the United States are interacting with the African community. Those are not mutually exclusive categories. They actually blend into one another. And so it's important for us to kind of think about that when we're assessing what it means to integrate Arab refugees, just the same way within the organization I was working with in New Britain. Think about how Sudanese Muslims working within the mosque, right, how they might be ostracized possibly by the fact that there are also Arabic speaking refugees who within the Levantine dialect, it's actually, people refer to Black people as slaves, and they claim not to be calling them slaves. That's just their word for Black people. Yet there's still this issue that's very explicit and an undercurrent, both linguistically, culturally, socially, amongst these communities. So we have to, as people who are working with and studying with these communities, be cognizant of that.
Yeah, Paul, did you want to respond to that? Paul has spent a lot of time with Egyptians in Cairo and with Sudanese in Cairo. Where are you, Paul? Well, no,
Yeah,
I'm just
here.
calling you out.
Yeah, I mean, is there one particular thing you'd like me to respond to? Sorry, like I mean, I was listening. It was just there was a lot said.
If you just had any thoughts on what Joy was saying about, sort of talking about how the language is used by Levantine Arabic toward Africans. Yeah, especially even Africans, refugees, like Arabic-speaking African refugees like Sudanese. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, also like the point you made about the word that slave is used to describe Black people. I mean, that's both mentioned in that code switch episode, but I mean, that's like, we worked like in Cairo. I mean, I lived in Cairo for like 5 years, and our RIT project went over the course of 3 years. And this is something that Sudanese people talk about all the time. And about their experiences at the mosque, for example, about being spit on, about being called slave, about, all sorts of like anti-Black racism directed towards them. And even within Egyptian, like in Egypt, right, you have Nuba people from southern Egypt, or people from like Saidi Egyptians who are, all different, like Egyptians going from all different shades of color, right, all the way to the point of being Black, but even them facing some anti-Black racism as well. And so, yeah, sort of just a bit similar to some of the things you were raising.
Yeah. Okay, I really, this conversation, we could go on for a long time. We're beyond our time, and I'm mindful of how people have limited Zoom appetites. We can stay on and chat through coffee break time, but I'm going to close the panel now. I would invite you all to stay on, to anyone who's interested to continue, but we will stop the recording now. So yeah,